My mission is to excavate from the past these crucial women and really bring them into the light of modern day, where we can see their contributions and understand their legacies.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to GBH's Beyond the Page with Marie Benedict. We're so thrilled to have you join us for tonight's event. I'm Craig LeMoult from GBH Newsroom, and I'm so excited to be here to host tonight's Beyond the Page event. It's my great pleasure to welcome Marie Benedict. Marie Benedict is a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author. She's written a number of books, including The Only Woman in the Room, Lady Clementine, and both The Personal Librarian and The First Ladies with co-author Victoria Christopher Murray. And most recently, Marie has released this genre-bending novel, The Queens of Crime, which blends classic mystery, historical fiction, and true crime into one real page-turner. We can't wait to hear her talk about it. So without further ado, please welcome to Beyond the Page, Marie Benedict. Hi, Marie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm just delighted to be here, Craig.
I'm so excited to talk to you. I really loved reading this book. Like I said, it was a page turner. I blew through it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm guessing not everybody joining us right now has had a chance to read it yet. So can you start us off just with a brief synopsis? Tell us, and tell us like really where you got the idea to tell a mystery featuring these very particular, very specific, and very real characters.
Absolutely. So the short version of what the Queens of Crime is about, it's about the five greatest mystery authors of the golden age of mystery and detective fiction, 1920s and 1930s. They were five incredible women who actually came together to solve a real life mystery. And in so doing, really secure justice, not only for themselves, as I'm sure we'll talk about, but also for the victim of this crime. And I kind of came to this, it's a long story. I don't know how long you've got tonight, Craig, but I kind of came to this story a bunch of different ways. But it really all began when I was a much younger woman, when I was in middle school, and I had this incredible aunt.
Hmm.
She was an English professor, she was a poet, and she was a rebellious nun. And she is the one who really kept me in books. And she started me on a lot of different paths in my life. But one of the things she instilled in me was a love of these books, this genre, this time period, this interwar between World War I and World War II time period
Mhm.
when most of these golden age of mystery novels were written. And when I kind of turned to writing these books, which again is a long story, how I came to my mission, but I was really curious about the women who had written these books that my aunt had given me, that I grew up loving, the time period, these kind of unsolvable puzzles that really sat at the core of these books. And when I went digging into these women and their lives, they were so much more fascinating than if I had made it all up from scratch. And that was really the beginning of my interest in these women. How
Mhm.
I came to write a murder mystery about them is a different question.
Well, let's hear about it. How did that wind up happening?
So, I was kind of deep in the rabbit hole about these women. It started with Agatha. These five women are Agatha Christie, who
Yeah.
everyone knows. She's really emblematic of the genre and the time period. Dorothy Sayers, she's really my main character. All five of these women play a huge role, but she was almost every bit as popular as Agatha during her lifetime. She wrote a
Really?
successful. We don't know her name today.
Yeah, I mean Agatha Christie, everybody knows Agatha
Eh,
Christie, but a lot of us didn't know about Dorothy Sayers.
it's well, I mean, this is a whole side conversation, but it's really interesting the way in which some of these women's names have survived and others haven't. But
Mhm.
I promise you, especially working where you work, you will probably know these women's characters. Agatha Christie, we know her characters, but Dorothy Sayers, in fact, wrote a really successful series starring Lord Peter Wimsey.
Right.
And he had a female sidekick, which was really unusual for the time. She was a mystery writer, and her name was Harriet Vane. And those books have been adapted on PBS and
Ah, right,
ABC.
yeah.
And that's true of most of the women Marjorie Allingham, she wrote about Inspector Campion, again, been adapted on PBS. Ngaio Marsh, another one of the queens of crime, a fabulous New Zealand woman. She wrote about Inspector Allen, again, adapted on PBS. So all of these,
Yes.
I know. I mean, this is really the home for this book and
Yeah.
these women's stories. In addition to all the other fabulous histories that you share. But
And then
and
there's Baroness Emma Orsi's the last one, right? And she wrote the Scarlet Pimpernel books.
exactly. Last but definitely not least, she had a really big personality. But yeah, she's most famous for Scarlet Pimpernel. Usually when I give talks, as soon as I say Scarlet Pimpernel, I hear like a oh in the audience. She's like the most famous. But she actually wrote mysteries as well. And that is what got her in the Queens of Crime and the Detection Club and all this sort of group of incredible women. So um when I was deep in my rabbit hole, kind of learning about these women, whose stories I had loved, but I didn't know their personal histories, I learned that Dorothy Sayers had actually been involved in solving a real life murder. Her husband was a crime reporter. He wrote for the News of the World, which was a huge publication at the time. And he was asked to cover this story, which was a huge news story at the time. A young English nurse had disappeared in unbelievable circumstances. I'll tell you what they are, but in this coastal town of France, she had disappeared in the fall. She had taken a day trip with a good nursing friend. You could take a ferry back and forth in one day. Just as they were about to depart, she stepped into a restroom, which had one entrance and exit, the only way in and out. Her friend
Mhm.
waited outside, and May Daniels, this young English nurse, never came out. She vanished into thin air. And you can imagine this caused this huge paparazzi incident because it seemed impossible. And yet it seemed torn from the pages of these women's books. That is like a classic locked room mystery, which is fodder for what these women typically write.
Right.
And so when Dorothy Sayers learned about her husband's assignment to cover this poor young girl disappeared in the fall and her body was found in the spring, to cover the murder, she thought to herself, wouldn't this make a great assignment? You can cover it from a crime journalist perspective, and I'll cover it from a crime mystery writer perspective. His editor loved it. And so the two of them set off for Boulogne to try and solve this mystery. And I just thought, what are the odds that this incredible mystery writer actually was involved in this unbelievable, tricky puzzle of the sort that she would normally write about? So that's kind of the genesis for this story, this marriage of historical fiction, which is what I typically write, and a real life murder mystery.
And yeah, that's the story that you tell in the book is the unsolving of this the effort to solve that. But you made a choice slightly different than what really happened, only which is that you brought these other writers together. You made the queens of crime a team that were trying to solve this mystery together.
Exactly. So originally it was just Dorothy who went off with her husband to do the investigation. I was so enthralled with this idea of having all the women go on the journey,
Yeah.
each bringing their own unique skill sets and insights. I mean, this group of women, they were multi-generational. They ranged in ages from their 20s to their 70s. They came from different continents. Marsh came from New Zealand. Baroness Orski was a Hungarian aristocrat in exile. They come from different socioeconomic classes, which was really rare for the time. This was an era when people really stayed within their strata. They didn't move around a lot. So these women's love of writing, love of mystery novels really knitted them together at a time when that was pretty rare. And I really, as I've gotten older, my female friendships are so important to me and so
Yeah.
enriching. And I really wanted to explore what that could look like in this context. So I
And
said,
they did really know each other
they
and
did.
yeah.
They were really friends. I mean,
Yeah.
these women routinely, and we can talk about how they came together, but these women routinely dissected murder mysteries that were in the crime section of newspapers. So even though they actually didn't all go on this journey to Boulogne to solve this crime, I feel certain that they would have discussed it. I
Oh
feel
yeah.
certain they would have dissected it. So I really just kind of brought them along for the ride that they were more metaphorically part of in the story.
And they're also part of what's called the Detection Club, which is and that's at the beginning, at the foundational beginning of the story, is the creation of the Detection Club, which Dorothy was one of the founders of. Um, and it's members take an oath not to include fantastical elements in their book, and it was all about building this reputation of the mystery genre, as you write, and of course that was also a very real thing, this Detection Club. And I was wondering about that effort to build the reputation of the genre, if there was something of like an inferiority complex among mystery writers, and
Absolutely.
I was also wondering if you feel that that exists to some degree today as well.
Oh, for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, the Detection Club was founded in 1930. Dorothy Sayers was one of the founders. There were several others, including Agatha was nominally a founder, G.K. Chesterton, who, does the very still, I'm sure they're shown on your channel, the Father Brown mysteries. They're
Oh yeah, I think so.
yeah, very popular.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's all people whose stuff has been adapted. They were considered really the best and brightest of this mystery group. And they came together, yes, to network and to socialize, which they did, and to have these fanciful rituals, which, by the way, Dorothy made most of them up. And I have learned from someone who recently, that Detection Club is still in existence, and they still have the same rituals. So, for example, Dorothy created this ritual for when people were sworn into the club. It was in a huge room with dark cloaks carrying lit candelabra, and you had to march to the front of the room and put your hand on what I thought was a theatrical skull, but I learned something recently that leads me to believe it might have been real. But anyway,
A real deal. Okay.
yeah, you had to put your hand on it and swear that you would, as a writer, solve your crimes or have your detective solve your crimes through logic, not through, uh, acts of God, feminine intuition, all these fanciful
Yeah.
things that authors, because this is really, in many ways, the real beginning of the genre. It was the creation time. And people were not always using the highest quality or the greatest logic in their puzzles and in their mysteries. And it was super important to Dorothy and the other members as well, but to elevate their craft to really, they felt, rightly so, that their books were well written. Their books were touching on really important issues, and that's especially the case with Dorothy. That they should be held to the same sort of standards and the same level of respect as other literature, that they should be reviewed in good publications, but they weren't finding that to be the case. And this was an effort on Dorothy's part to kind of bring that all up, to really
Mhm.
rise everybody up. And I think to your question, does that still happen today? Definitely. I mean,
Yeah.
books that are in sort of crime or mystery fiction, even books that are considered historical fiction, are often considered a little bit lesser than what would be considered traditional literature. Not by readers, but
Yeah.
by the arbiters of whoever that is, whoever those arbiters are. And I think
Do
I
you feel that at all? Like as you, because
a
you
little bit.
also blend genres yourself. I mean, this is a mystery, but it's also historical
It is.
fiction.
Yes.
How do you feel about sort of the different genres and writing in the different genres? Is it different to write them, and do you
Yeah.
feel that they're received differently than if they are mysteries?
I don't know that they're received differently. I think to me, every book has a purpose. Every book has a reader. Every
Yeah.
book, if you're a reader, you know that that book, the book that lands in your hand at just that right time can really change your life. And I know that from personal experience. When I was in middle school, a book was handed to me that literally set me on the path that I'm on today, the mission that I am. And I think that's true of all genres, all types. For example, romantasy, the blend of romance and fantasy is hugely popular
Yeah.
today. And I would say probably does that get reviewed as in the same way that literature is? Probably not. But does it have an important place in readers' hands? Absolutely, right? There that every book has a reader and has a purpose. And I think that's really important. So um do I see a difference in reviewing or respect? I think it varies. I think it does vary. For me personally, My mission is the same. My mission is to excavate from the past these crucial women and really bring them into the light of modern day where we can see
Yeah.
their contributions and understand their legacies. I choose, I always say that the women find me. I have a huge list of them, and then I follow where they lead. That
Mhm.
could be I've gone as far back as ancient Egypt, and I've come as close as the 1950s. I've gone to different continents. I've gone to different areas, science, writing, art, politics. I go where their stories need me to go, right? Need to take me. And I feel that same way with the format that I tell their stories. To me, how could I write? I wanted to write about these women, these five incredible women who've left a huge legacy for us, right? But whose names we don't often know. How could I not try and
It's got to
tackle
be a mystery.
mystery,
Yeah.
right? That's what
And
they're.
also there was an actual mystery that you were writing. I mean, it just, it kind of, it makes such
It
perfect
was sitting
sense.
right
And
there.
it works. It works so well. It's great. I need to know that book that changed your life, the book that was
Yeah.
put in your hand, which one was it?
So that book was given to me by that same aunt who
Yeah.
also gave me all the Agatha Christie's and the Dorothy Sayers. My aunt, who was the nun and the writer, she gave me this book called The Mists of Avalon. Most people
Okay.
have never read it. It was by Marion Zimmer Bradley. And this book was a female-centric retelling of the Arthurian legend. So instead
Hmm.
of a story about Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, we had a story about his wife, Guinevere, and his sister, Morgan Le Fay. And
Ooh.
those same historic events told through a different lens were completely different. And it
Yeah, of
really,
course.
for lack of a better word, really just like completely rocked my world. It shifted
Yeah.
my understanding. It made me question what history really is and who
Hmm.
gets to tell it. And could it really be all of history if we're only hearing a couple voices? And it really started me on the path of becoming a history major, considering being a history professor. I got detoured and ended up in law school for a long time, and as a lawyer, but really, when I look at the arc of my own life, it was always leading me back to that moment, to that book, to that kind of spark.
And really, what does a great book do other than to, make you just change the way you see the world? And it sounds like it did. That's a wonderful
Yeah,
experience.
if I can ever do that in any of my books, give somebody a fresh lens through which to look at the past or their present or their futures, that's would be such a gift.
I'm sure that you have.
Oh,
I want to make sure that we get to the viewers' questions. We have a ton of them coming in. Please throw your questions in the chat, in the Q&A, and upvote the ones that you want to see. Before we get to them, I have one last thing I really need to ask you about, which is, one of the things, one of the themes that really comes throughout is just like the incredible sexism that these women faced. Um, and from the male mystery writers who didn't want to include them in the detection club, but also just the it's clear the police could have solved this murder
yeah.
themselves if they bothered to speak to the women in the story, right?
Right, exactly.
And or listen to what they had to say. I was wondering, historically, the writers that you use here as your characters, were they standing up for feminism? Was that a big part of who they were? It seems to really come through in the story.
I wouldn't say that these women would have proclaimed themselves to be
Hmm.
feminists at the time. At different time, that word has had different meanings. But I would say that every single one of these women had absolute faith in women's capacity to do anything.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, Dorothy did many things in her life in addition to writing these novels. She translated Dante. She became basically a theologian, but she was very funny and she wrote a lot of essays. And one of her fabulous essays it's very tongue in cheek. Are women human? And it really like kind of takes this notion that women are lesser than and really turns it on its head, and it's very, very funny. But yeah, I mean, these women definitely dealt with an industry that was not exactly welcoming women with open arms, and by that I mean not just writing but also mystery writing, because women at that time were not why would they want to talk about blood and gore and murder? That was like not a woman's place, right? And
Right.
these women were diving headlong into those issues. And threaded throughout their books, which is something that I did when I researched this book, which I spent a lot of time doing research. Um, but what was interesting for the research of this particular book was that I reading their novels was actually part of it because authors leave little bits of themselves behind in the pages of their books. And in the case of Dorothy Sayers, that's particularly true because Harriet Vane, her sidekick character, is her. And through,
Oh, really?
oh, absolutely. And
All
through
right.
all of her books, Harriet Vane is expressing Dorothy's views about whether women can have it all, whether you can have a marriage and have a career, have children and have a career. What is your calling? I mean, she's taking all these issues that we would perceive as very modern issues, and she's really processing them through this character. But as you pointed out, those issues really, I think, come to a head in the murder investigation.
Yeah.
Um, the young victim, Mae Daniels, she was of a slightly different class than the main women. The five women were of varying sort of strata in the
Yeah.
socioeconomic ladder, but they were all well-educated, fairly affluent women. The woman who was murdered was actually a nurse. She was a single working woman.
Mm.
And that put her in this category, which I had never heard of until I did the research for this book, called a surplus woman.
Yeah.
Isn't that
That's
crazy?
I'd never heard that before reading this. It was so interesting, and it has so much to do with the war, right?
Right. So in the years during the war, World War One, of course, which they called the Great War because they didn't know another one was coming. But in during the Great War, women's had to step in, of course, and take over a lot of the male jobs when the men were working. After the war, when some of the men came home, the women were supposed to return to the homes. They were supposed to be married, raising the children, caring for their husbands. Um, but the reality is, in the years after the war, so many young men were killed, and the population as a whole was decimated. And so there were so many young women who, and especially as they got older, there were no men for them to marry. And so this whole generation of women had to work to support themselves. Now, you would think there would be some compassion for that, but that was not the case. There was basically a very negative perspective on these young women or older women because they weren't married, even though that hadn't been a choice in most of the cases. And so here we had young Mae Daniels, a young nurse. We don't know whether it was her choice to work, have or not, to have a family or not, but this was her path. And as a result, she was kind of lesser than. She was
Yeah.
considered surplus or extra.
The term is
So
so
insulting, so
insulting.
terrible.
It's
Uh,
unbelievable.
but it really became part of the authorities' perspective on her, and they really did not dedicate the amount of resources that they should have to finding out what happened to her. And that's really where the women stepped in. So, in a long-winded answer to your question, were they feminists?
Yeah.
Boy, they were not going to let the world marginalize this poor young woman. They were
Yeah.
going to step in and make sure that justice was done on her behalf. Even if society and the authorities weren't going to do it, they were going to do it for them. And I think that's, just such an important message in any era.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so many fantastic questions coming in, and we have one from that we got from three people. Betsy
Oh, wow.
and Mary and Margaret all want to know: do you do all your own research, or do you have any assistants? Does anybody work with you and help you do the research? Historians and other people working with you on that research?
What a good question. I mean, for most of the time you are looking at the staff. This is her right here. I mostly do my own, almost all my own research. I really find for me personally, I need to be in the rabbit hole of research to really kind of garner that relationship with the women or the woman and tell her story. So, I was a history major in college. I did very much consider going on to get a PhD in history. And so I'm not a historian by trade, but I do have quite a bit of training, and I do ferret out any kind of original source material that I can get my hands on. And, it varies wildly depending on the woman some people, there's an abundance, right? Some there's hardly any. And so I will go to archives, I will look for letters, I will look for it's interesting, and just take this case, for example, Dorothy Sayers. There are definitely some available letters which I used and were super helpful. Um, there are lots of autobiographies from a lot of these women, which is a great source and also a terrible source, because autobiographies are really the really narratives, very
Yeah,
heavily
not the most
edited
reliable always,
narratives.
right?
No, not
Yeah.
always. So you got to take those with a grain of salt. One of my greatest sources, too unusual for me, sources of material for this particular book were, first of all, as I mentioned, the women's novels. Dorothy Sayers in particular, her books with Harriet Vane are like a snapshot into her mind. And that's really rare. And what a great assignment for me for my
Yeah.
research, that I have to read novels. That was terrible. Um, and in the case of the murder of Mae Daniels, I can't even tell you how many hours I spent in the newspaper archives. That case was very heavily covered in all
Okay.
sorts of publications. I probably read hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of newspaper articles, and they gave varying accounts of varying reliability, of course.
Yeah, I would say like there you're not I wouldn't say that it's not that you're not complimentary of the journalists in there, but it's a very clear picture
Yeah,
of journalism that is unbelievably sensational and not always entirely accurate.
right. I mean, you're seeing what you start to see in these articles is the bias. You
Yeah.
start to see their view of her, the reporter's view of May as a surplus woman. You start to see, like, here's something that you would never know on first reading, but they always had pictures of May with this cute bobbed haircut, right? When you think of the 1920s and 30s, you think of those newly shorn haircuts, right? And they kept on talking about these haircuts in the newspaper articles. And I didn't think anything of it in the first 100 reads. I'm like, oh, she's got a popular hairdo. No, that was code. That
Uh,
hairdo was a modern hairdo. And if you had that type of a modern hairdo, you were not a traditional girl. If
mhm.
you were if you were a modern girl, you might also be might have some loose values, right? You might not be worthy of a deep investigation into what happened to you. So you're getting not only the facts of the case and the investigation, you're also getting a really interesting look through other people's eyes at what has happened here. And that was an education for me, for
Yeah.
sure. So again, that's a long-winded answer to the question, do I do all my own research? Yes, but I do consult experts as well.
Okay.
I have
Okay.
a new book coming out a year from now, and there is a whole storyline that's set in ancient Egypt, and I'm working with an Egyptologist on that because that's so far removed from tradition. I mean, I've done a lot of research, obviously, but that's a very, very refined area, and there's so little known that, when I feel like I'm a little bit outside my bounds, I will definitely consult experts. But most of the research I do myself.
We have a ton of great questions. We're going to jump right in. Darlene wants to know, yeah,
Craig, can I just say one quick thing?
please.
I just want to say I love GBH. I lived in Boston for 7 years and as a college and law school, and I loved you guys. I love you still, of course. But not only am I just excited to be here with you all, totally fangirling, but you guys are such a fabulous outfit. And I really do hope people support you because I mean, we've already mentioned about 10 shows tonight that you guys put on.
Yes.
But you
Yeah.
do so much more, both in general and for your community. So anyway, I had to get that out there.
Thank you so much, Marie. Thank you for doing that, for saying that, and for supporting
True,
GBH, and for being a fan of GBH.
totally.
We all really appreciate it, and we're really grateful to everybody who's supporting us. I really want to get to these questions. Darlene wants to know, who is the next woman that you'll be highlighting in a novel?
Well, I have a book coming out in about a year, which I hinted at a minute ago. It's called Daughter of Egypt, and it's the story of Lady Evelyn Herbert, who was the daughter of Lord Carnarvon, who owned and ran Highclere Castle, which is the estate upon which
Hmm.
Downton Abbey is based.
Oh, wow.
They
Okay,
were
cool.
also archaeologists. And before the Great War, Lord Carnarvon worked with an archaeologist, Howard Carter, who's quite famous. As they were about to embark on the first excavation post World War I, they were on the hunt, led by Lady Evelyn, for Queen or Pharaoh Hatshepsut, the only female pharaoh.
Mm.
She had one of the most successful reigns of all time, but at her death, her name was systematically chiseled out of every monument, every temple complex, every papyrus. And that is one of the most ongoing mysteries of ancient Egypt. They set out to find this Hatshepsut's tomb and the answer to this long-standing mystery. And instead, they found the tomb of Tutankhamun, the most famous archaeological discovery of all time. And Lady Evelyn was the first one in the tomb. So it's the story of this incredible find, but it's also the story of Hatshepsut. Woven through Lady Evelyn's story is the story of this most amazing pharaoh, Hatshepsut, and how she rose up to become one of the really only female leaders of that time.
That sounds so fascinating. That sounds like such a great
Yeah.
subject, and also like I know you're gonna do an amazing job of telling it. Let's reconvene here if we could to talk about that when it's ready. I'd love to do
Actually,
that.
I have to say, I've always loved ancient Egypt, huge fan, but the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has one
Oh
of the
yeah,
best collections of ancient Egyptian
yeah.
relics and artifacts. And I went when I was in college and law school, I used to go there all the time. And that was part of the spark for this book was spending time in that section of your museum. So it's also a Boston book. So there you go.
All right, I love it. I can't wait to read it. Elizabeth asks, did Sayers actually solve the real mystery?
Well, I don't want to give any spoilers. Let's just suffice it to say that these women came together and the resolution that is set forth in the book is absolutely based on possibility and based on conjecture and investigation that I saw in many, many of the newspaper articles that I read. So how does that sound with that? I'm threading the needle there, trying to give an answer without giving too
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's spoiling anything to say that like the mystery is solved in your book, right? Clearly, it wouldn't
right.
be a mystery book if you didn't provide
It's
us with the
true.
answer. But
Yes.
like, do we think that she got it?
Oh, do we think that Dorothy actually solved
Yeah.
it? The truth
Yes.
that the mystery was never solved.
Never
The
solved
authorities did abandon the investigation for the reasons we talked about because they didn't think that May Daniels was really worthy of that level of time and
it.
resources. I do think that the resolution haunted Dorothy Sayers because what I found in the books that she wrote, especially near in time to her investigation into May Daniels' murder, she posits bits and pieces of the answer to what happened to May throughout her books. That was actually another source of investigation and research for me. For an example, a book called Unnecessary Death, which came out pretty close to when May's murder happened. She had Dorothy wrote a scene almost exactly like the scene of May's disappearance.
Mm.
A restroom at a dock, a young woman goes inside, someone's waiting outside, the woman never comes out. And she has a resolution to what she thinks happened. And I'm not going to skirt around it. I definitely borrowed that because I figured who would know better than Dorothy, right? She was there, she investigated it. But I do think that even though the authorities didn't give May Daniels enough time and attention and credence, I think Dorothy spent a lot of time trying to figure out what really happened to her, even though the officials never did.
Okay. All right. Ed would like to know, do you have any current writers in the mystery genre you particularly like?
Oh, geez, I do, because I love this genre, obviously. I mean, I've been reading it my whole life. I kind of grew
Yeah.
up loving it. There are some wonderful modern writers who are kind of doing new takes on this, I feel like. I don't know if you guys know Richard Osman, who wrote The Thursday Murder Club, or Anthony Horowitz, who does two real excellent series. Again, all of which I think Anthony Horowitz has them on PBS, a series that came out recently based on his books. And I know there's going to be an adaptation of Richard Osman's. There's another one that came out recently. Oh gosh, the name is escaping me, but I think those two are doing an excellent job of taking this very classic structure, these murder
Yeah.
mysteries, and really injecting it with new life and vigor. But they're just two of many. This genre is on the ascendancy, and that's not uncommon. It goes in waves. You know, people always wonder why is this type of book popular, especially at different times? And I've thought a lot about it, and I really do think that there's something comforting about this is going to sound so weird, but there's something comforting about a murder mystery, right?
Yeah.
Something there's a perfect world and something becomes disordered, right? A violence happens. It isn't always a murder, it could be a theft or whatnot.
Sure.
And a detective, an individual comes into this disordered world and restores order.
Right.
Justice prevails. And those type of that ending, that resolution is comforting, especially in tumultuous times. And so
Yeah.
you see kind of the popularity of the genre kind of ebbing and waning, kind of depending on the world around it.
It makes me think of the whole true crime podcast wave that's been happening here, which is less satisfying because I think a lot of those don't actually wind up answering the mystery in the end. But
But
at
you
least the no mystery novel does.
Well, but you know what I think happens in those true crime situations is people envision themselves as the detectives
Yeah, they're playing the part.
playing the part. And so they're in an active role in the quest for the restoration of justice. And there's something satisfying about that you
Yeah.
can take that level of ownership about the world around you and have that sense of agency. I think there's something akin to what happens with murder mysteries with true crime.
We have a nice note from Carol who says, "You are my favorite author these days. I've learned so much from you. Were you a Nancy Drew fan?"
How did you know, Carol? Yes, of course. I
Of
love
course.
Nancy Drew. I mean, who didn't? Hardy Boys too, although definitely lesser than the Nancy Drew books. I'm sorry for all the Hardy Boys fans out there, but yes, and thank you for your kind words, Carol. That's like you're making me blush.
I think a lot of people in this chat probably agree with her. Elizabeth asks a question that I think you've touched on a fair amount, but she asks, how factual is the Queens of Crime? I mean, there's a lot of history here. There's a lot of true things that happen. The conversations between the characters and things like that clearly are made up, but it sounds like you've really gone to great pains to make this a very factual book.
I do my best. You know, it's tricky because, you know, in any given chapter, I could tell you which part is based on the historical record, which part is logical extrapolation from the record, which part is just pure fiction, right? But the way, like an overarching answer, and if people have questions about a particular scene or whatever, I'm more than happy to answer that. But a kind of an overarching answer to that would be this, you know, the way I look at what I write is that I do a tremendous amount of research. And actually that's why I write these books. You have to love research to write these books because you spend a tremendous amount of time doing it.
Yeah.
That research, which can vary, the record can vary very much, woman to woman, time period to time period, but it's the architecture of the story. It's the foundation, it's the pillars, it's the roof upon which the story hangs. There are always places between the pillars that are shadowy, that we don't really know the answers. You know, like you said, we might know a date upon which two women came together and had tea, but we don't have a video replay of their conversation. That conversation is the fiction, right? So it's a fiction that is derived from the historical record. It's a logical extrapolation of the characters, the time
Mhm.
period, the facts that I do know. And that's my legal training and my 10 years as a lawyer right there. Putting to good use. I'm sure my parents will be thrilled. Um,
Nice.
but you know, there's a lot of things that we don't know, right? And that's the fiction. Sometimes it's funny the way that the fiction proves to be true later. I've had so many situations where I've been out on the road talking to people, and I'll have a family member come up and tell me that something that that was a logical extrapolation, but clearly fiction, was actually true
Mm,
so many
mm.
times.
That's
And
got to be satisfying.
it is. And I'm sure I don't always get it right, but it is because you really, these books are, I write them to honor these women. These women are not always perfect. I do not always write a beautiful, fanciful tale where everyone's, Cinderella and finds their prince. These women are flawed. Some of them have had very difficult lives. In the case of Dorothy Sayers, she's hiding a life-changing secret that would literally ruin her life personally and professionally if it came out. But it's
Which is
so
in the book, but we won't mention it here because we want to give that away.
exactly. I mean, but it is hugely important for the story itself. Um, it is so often that those flaws define who we are. Those flaws make us who we are, and they can make us great. So, when I'm honoring these women in the stories and really trying to give them a second chance at having their lives and legacies understood and celebrated, it's not always perfectly flattering, but I've been so fortunate that to date, and I just knocked on wood, I've had such incredible responses from families. And I feel very, very fortunate in that.
That's great. That's great. One person asks, what do you most struggle with as a writer?
That's so different for different books. Sometimes let's give you an example. I've written three novels about women scientists. The other Einstein, about Mileva Marish Einstein, Albert Einstein's first wife, a physicist herself. The Only Woman in the Room, which is about Hedy Lamarr, who was a film actress, but also a self-taught engineer. She created something for the war effort, but it turned into Wi-Fi. Her Hidden Genius, which is about Rosalind Franklin. She was brilliant. Like we'll call her a chemist. She was so much more than that. She actually discovered the structure of DNA, and her research was taken without her knowledge or permission by two men you definitely know, Francis Crick and Crick and Watson, who won the Nobel Prize. All of these women's stories, I really felt strongly deserved to be told. And I am not a scientist. So, I said earlier, I go where the women take me. If it's in science, I got to figure out the science. And so sometimes it's not just even that I'm learning the science, I'm learning pre-Einstein physics or pre-Rosalind Franklin genetics. I mean, it's tough. So
Yeah.
that is often where I will have somebody come in and, I have a friend who is, she's a scientist and she helped me. One of my sons is a budding astrophysicist and he really helped me. So but I really do need to learn it myself also. And so that has been probably the greatest challenge, is that in telling these women's stories, in honoring them the way that I want to honor them, I sometimes have to go into areas that are not my natural area, and I have to do justice to what the women have done. And that can be difficult.
Sort of along those lines, Sally asks, what advice do you have for writers working on their first novel?
Oh, geez, what a good question. The thing I would say, and I don't know if I can only draw from my own experience, right? I wasn't somebody who always wanted to be a writer. I was somebody who loved history, right? I wasn't somebody who was meant to be a lawyer. That those untold stories in history beckoned to me. And then suddenly I had an idea for a book. When I set out to write my very first book, I just wanted to finish it. I didn't want to be somebody who always had this idea, because I hear a lot of people say, I have a great idea for a book. I need to get started, or if only I could give it, just do it. Write the book. You can always edit it later. You can always rewrite it at a different point. Take your idea and run with it, and then see what you can do with it. Don't overanalyze every single word. Don't get in your own way. Take your
Yeah.
dream and run. And that is always my number one advice, is do the writing and treat it like a job. Set aside time every day. If you really want to do it, you have to give it the time and energy and attention that it deserves.
It's great advice no matter sort of what your goal is. We can sit around and think about doing something forever and not actually just sit down and make that first step towards doing it. So that's great advice. We have a question from Margie who is wondering how you feel about the Lisa Worsley series that was on PBS about Agatha Christie and her disappearance. And I think which also brings up a key point that I learned about in reading this book, which I didn't know that Agatha Christie had disappeared for a period of time. Tell us about that, and also, are you familiar with the series that Margie's asking about?
I am. I actually wrote a book about Agatha's disappearance. It's called The Mystery of Mrs. Christie. It was my first foray
Mm,
into these women's lives, and it's actually where I started to learn more about Dorothy Sayers. Um, Agatha Christie, it's fascinating. I grew up loving Agatha Christie. I wanted to know more about her. And when I learned that she actually disappeared for 11 days in circumstances that it seemed like she wrote them herself,
yeah.
I was fascinated. And the more I dug into it, the more and no one really knows what happened to her during those days. That's why there's been so much written about it. That's why there's series about it. That's why there's been movies about it. There's been other books about it. I
And it
felt
was tabloid fodder at the time.
Oh, I mean, it was an international story. And that actually, I'm glad you brought that up because that tabloid fodder, that I think that was completely unanticipated on Agatha's part, and it changed who she was. That the story of her disappearance is the story of who she is, how she got to be the Agatha Christie that we think of now.
Hmm,
It turned her in exploring her disappearance. Of course, it was a puzzle I wanted to solve myself, but it was also the story of how she came to be the most successful writer in all of history. She has sold more books than anybody else. And how
hmm,
does that come to be? And that's in part what happened, without giving too much away, what I think happened during those 11 days, what that meant for her as a person, what that meant for her as a professional, and then how it totally changed her personality. I mean, she was a person who, she was adventurous and had a gregarious personality. She was the first European woman to surf. I mean, she would try anything. Afterwards, she was
really?
oh yeah, yeah, she was the very first. Um, she was a recluse. Getting Dorothy, and I do talk about it in this book. This is a post disappearance book. Dorothy, I really got very interested in Dorothy because in doing the research for Agatha's disappearance, I learned that Dorothy had been called in to help solve the crime. She and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, don't ask me why the police thought the two mystery fiction writers were going to help find Agatha Christie when they couldn't. I don't know. But these two came onto the scene, and I just started to become fascinated with Dorothy. I'm like, how great
Yeah.
was she that the police called her in to try and help find Agatha? Um, so that episode in her life, I think, was absolutely pivotal in who she became. And it is fascinating, right? And for my part, and again, I write fiction. So um, I do not believe that a woman as skillful in the art of plotting as Agatha Christie had no hand in her own vanishing.
Hmm,
And I'll leave it at that.
hmm. Okay. In one really great scene in the book, the queens all talk about their different methods for writing a detective story. It's kind of fun to see the different ways they go about it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the different ways to write a mystery story, how these different women did it differently. And also, I was wondering which method is closest to your own. I mean, you're going at it in a very different way because it's so
Yes.
historically based. But I loved that discussion of writing amongst these, giants of mystery writing.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I loved it too because I was curious how they did it, right? I mean, they all do have sort of different styles and different areas of interest and different characters, but the threads are very similar throughout. And what I learned is that, the different elements that we think of when we think of one of these books, the plot, the character, the puzzles, however you break down those elements, they each really latched on to different things. Like Agatha, and she's been criticized for this over the years, right? She's all about the plot. You know, I'm not saying she doesn't care about the characters, but they're definitely secondary. Some of the other women, it's all about the characters.
Mhm.
And then the characters take the writer where she needs to go. There isn't this
Right.
meticulous plotting out. And you can see it in the way that their books evolve. You know, Agatha's books are very, very plot, mystery, puzzle driven. That's her strength, and that's the way she approached the stories. Some of
Didn't
the
she start at the end? I like did she
Yeah,
knew
where
and kind of
it was
worked her way
going.
back, or
Some of the
and
other
other
women, like
people.
Nio, it's like she didn't even know what was going to happen. It was like she was going to follow the characters. And I think for me, it was fascinating for me. You know, I have writer friends and I love to hear them talk about how they do it. It's so interesting in this context because you're dealing with a very similar set of elements. How do you approach those elements? And for me, I found little bits and pieces of myself in all of their approaches. You know, I'm not the same level of plotter that Agatha Christie is. I wouldn't even put myself in her same category. She's a queen among women, queen among writers. But I do know where I'm headed, always, you know. But I do, like some of the other women, leave the door open for where the characters are going to take me. So I saw a little bit of myself, and because they don't write historical, I'm also really the track of history. I'm very wedded to that as well. So that's a different element than what they deal with. But yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
We have a couple questions about writing under a pen name.
Oh, unlike kind of like some of the other women. Yes. So my real name is Heather Marie Benedict Terrell, and I actually wrote 7 novels as Heather Terrell before I started writing books as Marie Benedict. They are all exploring similar themes, hidden corners of history, the different lenses through which we view the past, but they are different genres, very much so. The first 3 books approach those questions um, from the structure of historical suspense, 3 storylines, 2 historical, 1 modern day. And then I wrote some books that I hope help younger readers understand how history is formed, right? But I often look at those books, you know, there's 7 of them, and I often look at them as writing exercises for what I do now. You know, what I learned in writing the first 3 books, which were
Mhm.
historical suspense, was that I actually liked writing the historical sections. I didn't like writing the modern day sections,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then in turning to history through a younger lens, those books are almost always written in the first person. They're a more intimate portrayal because that's what those readers are interested in.
Mm.
And what I learned is I liked that. I liked looking at history through a more intimate lens, through one person's eyes, through a closer held perspective. Um, and I was always interested in women's histories and women's perspectives. And it really kind of, I felt like all of those brought me to where I was supposed to be all along.
Great. Okay. We have a couple minutes left, and I want to get to a couple more questions if we can. First, Erica says that she loved Queens of Crime and all the books you've written. She says, I noticed in all of your books you use very short chapters, often capturing the same scene in multiple chapters, which she says is unusual. I'm curious how and why that style evolved in your writing. And it's very true in the Queens of Crime.
Yeah.
They are very short chapters, which I personally, as a reader, really actually appreciate. I enjoyed the short chapters.
That's such a good question. Literally, nobody has ever asked me that before. And I don't know that I have an answer. It's except to say this, I hear the stories in my head as I'm writing them. And that's how I hear them. I hear the beats at the beginning and the end. I can feel when I'm building to the end of one chapter and on to the next. That probably explains the length of them. I do like, depending on the story and the structure I'm using, I do sometimes like to explore the same scene through different characters' eyes. I love to do that. And so sometimes it'll be the same exact, scene. I've done it whether it's one of my co-written books with Victoria Christopher Murray, whether it's a book like this where we do have different characters and we are kind of looking I almost always have a first person narrative, but so I do love that because I do think it's only by looking at a particular scenario through multiple perspectives that we can actually get a full picture. And I think drawing the reader into that experience, I hope, is helpful. I don't.
Yeah, it's super interesting to see the same thing happen from different perspectives. As a reader, I always really enjoy a scene like that. It's
Yeah.
kind of fun. It's very revealing about the characters and what's
Yeah.
happening. We have a question from Kathy who wants to know, when will you write about a Boston or at least a Massachusetts woman? We have plenty. And did I hear you say earlier that your next book is sort of is there a Massachusetts angle of that? Maybe I misheard you.
No, 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 definitely, because I did a lot of my research over the years at the Museum of Fine Arts. You guys have
Mhm.
an absolutely amazing collection of Egyptian work and of excuse me, Egyptian relics and artifacts. And a lot of that stuff is what kind of sparked my fascination with Hatshepsut and really sparked this book to life in many ways. Oh, I have a very, very long list of women. I mean, seriously, sometimes there's women on there, like with my co-written book, The Personal Librarian, Belle DeCosta Green. She was on my list since I was a lawyer in New York in the a very long time ago, decades ago. And she was on that list for literally for decades. So, there's one particular Boston woman in my mind, but I also have an idea that I'm
Oh,
exploring.
but you're not going to tell us who it is?
I can't tell you. But there's definitely a couple other women who have Boston ties. I love Boston. I mean, it is a place that really does have my heart, and I keep hoping that one of my children will end up there. I don't know that I can move up there. But as I mentioned to you guys earlier, one of my brother and his family live in Boston, so I spent quite a lot of time there, and I just absolutely love it. The history, the culture, the people. I love it.
Well, next time you're in town, please stop by GBH and say hello. We'd love to see you. And I'm so excited to hear about your new book, and we will be eagerly awaiting that. I cannot wait to read that as well. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We just this hour has completely flown by. We had so many
Oh my
great
God.
questions too, and I'm sorry if you asked a question that we didn't get to. We had tons of great questions. We got to as many as we could. But Marie Benedict, thank you so much. This has just been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, to learn about this book and your writing process. And I can't say how much I enjoyed reading this. Thank you for this as well. And thank you for joining us. And I also want to thank everybody who's joined us today for all of your great questions, and for being part of this conversation, and for supporting GBH. Thanks to everybody. And again, Marie, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been an absolute delight.
Take care, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.